Hello and welcome to Data Conversations with myself, Craig Stewart. I'm joined this morning by Veronica, Brits and Bammesberger from Meltwater. It's their second time on the show. I met them at DataCon in the real world last year, March. I can't believe that was almost a year ago. Time has absolutely flown. So it's good to have Veronica and Lays back on, and I'll introduce them a bit more and allow themselves to introduce themselves a bit more in a bit. But just a quick shout out, very commercial now, sponsored by Seam Coffee. So I've got all the merchandise. It's quite nice to get free stuff. I think I need to get the podcast sponsored by SA Home Loans or something, so I can get my home loan sponsored as well. So if anybody from SA Home Loans is watching, you know where to find me. I have arranged a 15% discount from Seam Coffee. So if you use the code BOD 2021, which is part of our Business of Data Content Hub, you get as I said, 15% off tea, coffee, and chocolate from seam.co.za, and it lasts for a month. And if you do like these videos, please do hit like and obviously subscribe to our channel as well. So with all the advertising out the way, Veronica, Lays, great to see you again. How are you both doing?
Yeah, good to see you, Craig. Doing well on my side, thank you.
That's good.
Yeah, also doing great. Thanks, Craig. Can't believe it has already been a year, well, close to a year since the last podcast. Time flies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I was just think time is flying by so quickly at the moment. How are you both doing sort of in the virtual world? Kind of settled into it now a bit?
Yeah, I think I can probably successfully say I know how to unmute, on time and, really function well and building relationships virtually.
I would say the same. I think seeing more of a human side to everyone you work with, where they live, who they live with, if it's, kids or dogs or, it's just so much nicer to have that deeper connection that you wouldn't have otherwise if it weren't for Zoom and just working from home.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the best thing now is that you can be a cat. On Zoom as well. I haven't quite figured that out yet, but I think that's probably the best thing on the internet at the moment is the lawyer with the cat filter, which is funny in itself, but I thought it was pretty awesome how he constantly said, I am live, I'm not a cat. And the judge was like, I kind of get that you're not a cat. So I just think that's brilliant. I love how he just carried on with it. It wasn't that worried about being a cat for the whole of the meeting, which is cool. So maybe I'll figure that out. I don't know what kind of I'll channel some spirit animal and do that for the next podcast, and people can watch me as a cat or something. Cool. So what we want to talk about today on the podcast with Veronica and Lays really is something that Meltwater is quite focused on at the moment, is that of 2021 digital predictions. Veronica, maybe let's start with you. We kind of chatted over email prepping for the call. You really talked about not being able to foresee COVID or the impact of COVID, or the fact that it's going to be, pretty deep into 2021. Maybe you can just sort of, shed some light on your thoughts around that, and then we'll go to Lays as well.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So I think, it comes as no surprise that the pandemic that impacted everybody around the world has changed the way all of us are behaving online. It also started putting a lot of pressure on e-commerce strategy. I mean, Amazon in itself in its second quarter saw up to 40% more sales, and they are e-commerce driven quite naturally. Organizations that hadn't taken the time to step into that prediction and really understanding where consumers are buying and how they're thinking would certainly have fallen behind, and you can only do that with data. Other aspects that we've also seen is the major need for research. Data has a requirement to understand how do we now combat future pandemics or look at any other potential issues like the impact of global warming. There's just a need for organizations to really become more predictive with how they're going to drive their own business strategy forward, impact global economies. I just feel like COVID really started putting a lot of pressure on the need for scale and understanding scale and how consumer behavior has changed. And that can't be possible if you're not accessing data.
Yeah. And I think that's the key thing. I think at the moment, what I've kind of found is that companies are really focused on their data analytics now more than ever before, and really understand that customer and where they're buying. and who's kind of behind the curve. I think one of the sort of things around that is also how quickly you can take something new to market with predictive analytics. How can you change your strategy? Like Checkers has changed to the, probably the absolute best under 60 minutes home delivery service. And that was obviously driven by, understand more people are going to be working from home. They need things quicker, etc. And I think that's something that they've done particularly well around that. Les, what are your thoughts around, predictive analytics, how people are using data now more than ever?
Yeah, I think there's so many interesting statistics out there looking at, the growth of social media users. For example, in 2020, there was a 10% increase of social media users in the year, which is a lot. I think when thinking about, quarantining and lockdown, there was definitely a sense of wanting to create a community and wanting to communicate outside of, not being able to go out and celebrate wins or to express feelings, like express how you feel about a brand. But I think the social media growth usage has really shown how people are looking for outlets to connect, and not only as humans but also as consumers. So I find that companies that are not on social media, or companies that are not making the most of social commerce or making the most out of social conversations, have really seen a decrease in revenue and a decrease in performance last year because of that delay. So if 2021 predicts anything, I think it is the need for any and every brand to be present online, but also present on social media. Not only for research purposes. I mean, as a social media consumer myself, I go on social media to find resources before I buy a product, to ensure that they're a legit brand before I buy online, so that I feel confident as a consumer. And I think even for business to business buyers, they also go online to check if this company is legit, what is their I think ratings, how do they communicate with their customers at the moment. Would I just be left in the dark? So I think 2021 is going to really maximize that for companies that have already established a strong presence in 2020. I think they're really going to reap the benefits of that this year. If you think about ad spending, for example, it's estimated to grow by 2.5% this year. Ad spending worldwide is currently at $300 billion. And then you add to that the privacy laws that the likes of the California in the United States is implementing, and other states to also implement in the future. It's really a space that you need to collect as much data as possible from your earned and your owned media, so that you can really benefit from the paid media aspect and the ad spending, and also the privacy laws that are going to affect that in the future, not only in the States, but also worldwide, including South Africa.
Yeah. I'd like to get both of your thoughts on, personalization is a very big part of customer experience, customer service, product development, etc. And now obviously we're talking a lot about hyper-personalization as well. And sort of the tie-in, and to get both of your thoughts, you're talking a lot about social media, your own account, but also looking at consumers' accounts. Last year we talked about social listening. We talk about data privacy. What are your sort of thoughts? How do companies get to that point of really building a really personal experience for their customer, but not being sort of creepy and sort of going against any data privacy laws, or sort of really, I guess, just the spirit of the regulation, never mind the actual letter of it. Veronica, I don't know if you want to kick off with that, and then we'll...
Yeah, definitely. I think in terms of really understanding what personalization looks like, we need to be listening on sort of media and social to see how the conversation changes across different social channels. It isn't a surprise that if you're on Twitter, you behave a specific way. You tend to give a little bit more feedback. When you're on Facebook, you tend to be a little bit more personal. When you're on Instagram, everything is about images and quite crisp and clear. It's not that personal. On YouTube, you have a different behavior. It's not a high performance, sort of, it doesn't have a massive turnover and an investment from an ad spend, but it really captivates the market and makes them feel connected because of the video imaging. So in personalization, and any sort of strategy requires a fundamental understanding of what that behavior looks like across these different sources. And that can only be, driven through actually monitoring data. In terms of not becoming too creepy, I think one massive trend that I've seen really taking to market is user-generated content. When I'm sitting on my social channels, I'm seeing a lot of people doing personal posts for brands, and these aren't paid for social influencer strategies. These are just people trying to engage in a virtual world where we literally cannot have human contact with one another. So again, talking about how this entire pandemic has really demanded a change in our behavior and how we are interacting with one another. And it speaks into the same strategy for businesses. The traditional marketing funnel, moving it, from the top of the filter right down to the buying decision really has changed. I don't believe that it really looks like a funnel anymore. Fundamentally, it's about understanding who you're speaking to. You mentioned a great example of a customer, like Checkers, that really innovated with the Checker 66 application. But you wonder to yourself, when you're on the application, how do they convert the sale in, of the strategy? If I'm on the application, potentially I'm looking for smaller bulk deals, not family size deals. And that again speaks into personalization, landing pages that are personal. So, you can take the traditional approach on banner ads, but again, you wouldn't understand who you're speaking to if you don't understand what's resonating with your customer. And those behavior really lays behind artificial intelligence and understanding consumer buying personas. What affinities do they have, and what brands are they speaking to? So again, it doesn't take much to get all that data. It's publicly available to us without having to really stalk or go and access personal, private information from the consumer. So I guess one thing I would stress is that user-generated content is a great way forward in terms of driving data, not infringing on any data privacy, and really getting the consumer to tell us how they feel and what their experience is when they're engaging with brands.
All right. Just maybe just before we go to Lays, just putting your consumer hat on at the moment. Do you find that, when you're doing, almost all shopping these days is digital, anything you do, obviously with cookies, ads follow you around, there's always promoting things. How do you feel from a consumer point of view? Because I think I always kind of make it a bit dramatic that it's creepy, etc. But for the most part, personally, I think it's great. There's always something that pops up that you're interested in. I don't find it too invasive or weird. How do you feel as a consumer? Obviously, there's a big part of your role professionally to drive things like that. But from a consumer point of view, how do you feel about it? Is it adding value?
Yeah. At first, I think I was also a little bit skeptical about having this virtual avatar that's constantly being read and, psychologically analyzed and really trying to push towards me what they think I need. But when I'm online, I generally am overwhelmed with all the options I have available. And I've been really impressed with some of the organizations driving strategy that is paying attention to how I'm driving search queries and building some sort of golden thread between that. The personalization has made me feel like this worldwide internet has become something that I also have a direct association with. So I don't feel as lost or disconnected. And I think in a world, where we all of a sudden have access to global networks, it's kind of nice to feel that it's still personal. In South Africa, we have 45 million different people driving different types of behaviors, and somehow they manage to speak to me directly. I'm really actually kind of impressed with that. So it's not as a consumer, I'm quite grateful that they're applying these initiatives and strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Lays, your thoughts around the sort of the personalization, hyper-personalization, and I guess how you feel as a consumer as well?
Yeah, I think personalization is great. I absolutely love it. I think it saves time. I think it saves effort. I find out about brands that I've never heard of before when doing research on a specific product that I want to buy. I think the creepy part comes when you don't know where the data is coming from and when you don't read your terms and conditions. Who has time to read terms and conditions? I am one of the possibly few people that really enjoy reading terms and conditions, especially when, you know, Facebook and Twitter send me an email to say, hey, we have new terms. Not only because that's the industry that I'm in and that it could possibly affect you know, how we're consuming data as a company and how we're providing clients social media data, but also as a user. For me to know what is being, you know, taken away from my daily usage. For the longest time, I refused to use Siri because I was so scared of Siri and what kind of data that Siri would take away from my conversations. But if you take the time to read the terms and conditions, we accept them all, right? I think when we got an understanding of what is being shared on Facebook versus WhatsApp versus Telegram, for example, everyone wanted to leave WhatsApp. But at the end of the day, the terms and conditions were always there. But what I do appreciate is how these big companies like Google and Facebook are now really revising the terms and conditions in relation to the privacy laws. And I think we're going to see a big shift of that. Personalization is key for consumer health in terms of how long is my journey, how accurate is my journey, how long does it take for me to complete my journey as a consumer until I find my product that is a good fit. But I think for companies, specifically the personalization section of it, it's really understanding the consumer and telling them, hey, we hear you, we know you're there, and we know that we're a good fit. Let's you know, collaborate, let's partner. And that's the same for sponsorships, right? Like when you listen to a podcast like ours and you hear about a coffee brand, it's also personalization, because we're identifying that we love coffee, we love talking over coffee. You know, this is a great audience to speak to. So I think personalization doesn't only come from ads, it comes from any partnership, but it's good, right? Imagine if this podcast was sponsored by a fishing company. I don't know if this would go as well, and I think I would get a little bit confused by it. So I think it's great. I absolutely love personalization.
Yeah. And sort of where do you both think that companies are maybe going a little bit wrong in terms of actually using the insights that they get from, you know, ads, cookies, social media, listening, etc.? Because it's all great that this stuff exists and people know it. But it's like anything. If you don't actually put it to use, it's got zero value. You know, it's kind of got potential value until you actually do something with it. So what have you seen sort of in your experience as the challenges or sort of the reasons why companies don't use this properly? I mean, it's such a wealth of information. You know, people on Instagram, you know, you've got Facebook, you've got your professional side on LinkedIn, all those sorts of things. But you know, sometimes it can go wrong or it doesn't get used at all. What are some of the reasons you think, you know, people are struggling with, or you know, what's hindering the process there?
I mean, from my side, I think they're lacking context. You know, the importance of data is the collective narrative. It's understanding the wisdom and how the information pulls together. When you're accessing different social sources like Facebook or, you know, Google or Instagram, you're really just captivating an audience list. You may have potentially started your buying journey by getting people to engage with your application, but you haven't truly gotten them to either start making buying decisions. And I think what organizations are lacking is their ability to understand fundamentally what is the decision to get the customer to buy, because it's quite clear that there's very little brand loyalty with all the options that are available at our fingertips, and we're always looking for the best deal. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong for a consumer to be that empowered. For organizations to really get the conversion that they're looking for, they need to understand how to take that audience list and start actually understanding what resonates between these customers. So I think that's where Meltwater actually bridges the gap quite nicely. As a software service, you know, we don't fundamentally get involved in the advertising on the different social sources, and we don't drive the performance campaigns behind that specifically. That really is up to the organization or their agency strategy, using their own initiatives to build out the data that they have to get these audience lists in place to get the targeted advertising. What we bring to the collective is the understanding of the contextual narrative. And I think what the future also holds is moving away from that very much that dashboard feel where you have some analytical overview of what the performance looks like, and really having real-time insights and understanding what the impact is of the campaign right now versus tomorrow or a week from now, because that honestly is how quickly consumers' behaviors are changing and how many options are becoming available. So I think fundamentally, just to reconfirm that, I think they might have the right initiative in place, but they are lacking the contextual wisdom to actually implement the data that they have.
Yeah, okay. Some good points there. I'll come back to those. I just want to get Laser's view on that as well, and we can talk a little bit more about why people don't necessarily trust the insights or put them into action.
I also think it's too many vendors, and a lot of vendors don't speak to each other. So if you're really into data, you have, so many different options out there of, softwares that can collect data, that have data, but they don't really speak to each other. And then companies fail to centralize vendors that actually do speak to one another and that can feed the most data. And I think when you have too much data, you take it for granted and you don't make the most out of it, or you find it as something that will take too long to implement, too long to clean up, too long to integrate, and you end up not doing anything at all. So as much as data is great, I think you need to be selective about the vendors that you're working with, not just working with everyone, and really making use of the data. So if you're going to take on a vendor, make sure that the implementation plan is really tight and that you can, finalize it as soon as possible and make use of it as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I just wanted to come back then to sort of, I guess, this idea of who's collecting the data, who's managing the data within the organization, then who's actually using the data. Because I guess what we're kind of talking about here today is probably 3 departments. There's obviously a lot more, but the data analytics team within the business, the marketing team to understand the campaigns, what do we need to do to get out to the customer, what's the message, personalized, etc. And then obviously the customer experience department as well. Now the 3 fairly important departments within the organization. Do you think that they're gelling enough? Do you think that they're kind of sharing data, sharing ideas, co-creating models, or they're all working in silos, which is an age-old problem? I get that. We could probably talk about that on every episode, but those insights that people are getting from social media, or let's say unstructured and structured data, doesn't get used correctly. Is it just because that the teams are not talking to each other properly and sort of coming up with a common goal?
I think from what I have seen, even within the marketing department, one of the predicaments of 2021, or what we can predict, is that there's going to be a bridge in the gap between even marketing, PR, and social media managers. You would think that they are integrated within the department and they communicate very well, but for the longest of time, these were 3 different separate units talking about different types of media. And for the first time, we're saying platforms like Meltwater that combines information across all 3 units. So let's start there, right? Within one single division, there are silos within it that we predict that they're going to finally join forces. So that's step 1. I think step 2 is definitely to have a communication with actionable insights. We focus so much on meetings, right? Let's meet, let's talk, let's discuss, let's share information. But what about actionable insights? What about after the meeting? Are you really following a plan after the meeting between the 3 divisions, or are we just sharing ideas, sharing knowledge, and then nobody reads anything or the summary or the notes in relation to the meeting, but then you can say, I met with them last week, but did you really do something about it afterwards? The most successful companies that we see out there, I personally really love talking about Netflix, because I really see the joint forces between marketing and data analytics, like the recommendation engines, right? It's really exciting to see that, but it's really joint forces between marketing, what we see on social media, versus the recommendation engines. What do we see when we go into the platform? And it's just a seamless transition between the experiences, and you can really see the departments talking with one another. But yeah, hopefully 2021 will bring marketing and PR and communications together, and then afterwards we're going to see more actionable insights across data analytics and customer experience as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's definitely this sort of convergent path that most departments are on towards using the data, collecting the data, using it, modeling it, putting it, the insights into action. Veronica, what are your sort of predictions and thoughts around that topic?
Well, so in short, I think businesses are still quite a far way from that. I think some of your most sophisticated organizations, fundamentally have it right, but I think it's no surprise that one of the hardest things to have really successfully implemented is artificial intelligence. People don't really through and through know how to use it quite well in the organization. Even though it is predicted to have a significant impact, it can, catapult you, above the rest of the market. But what are we really doing inside of the business to ensure that? And I think organizations are still in a traditional mindset of, clustering their own strategy. Customer service does one thing, marketing does another, sales does another, and there's no way to really pull the threads together, because how do we bring structure to the data, and how do we make sure that we actually understand how to implement what we see across the three departments? It's probably a little bit more complicated than, simply implementing a solution. And a lot of the time, the biggest question we're asking ourselves is, what are we going to do with this data that we have right now? How is it actually going to make a difference in our organization? I think one of the trends going forward, and I believe this should probably be a massive strategy for any organization, is having like hyper converged scale. And that could be anything from cloud infrastructure, network infrastructure, or specifically data infrastructure, or even something as their performance campaigns. And that can't be driven without a unified strategy. Unfortunately, if the unified strategy is lacking and they don't have a complete end-to-end overview of the customer experience, the impact point from sales, and the marketing initiatives, they're just going to be running arbitrage models like they very much were traditionally doing when all the information is readily available to them. So yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one. We do a lot of educational strategies with customers within the African market. And a lot of time when I do the analysis for the customer, I see two clear components coming out. Impact that they can drive through organizational control and then non-organizational control. Aspects by doing really solid marketing and driving investment into a marketing strategy that can be controlled using data, and then organizational issues like poor stock or understanding community management or mistargeting, again, lacking the insights that potentially marketing had already brought to the table but wasn't being taken into account. And again, you have that poor customer experience coming from that when somebody places an order but the stock isn't available or there's a delay in delivery times. Seems like small issues, but I think if we're living in an e-commerce world, that's really effectively what we're looking for. We're looking to click a button. We're wanting you to stick to your promises, like Checker 66, deliver in 60 minutes, good fresh produce, really the simplicity.
Yeah. And I think what I've found is sort of your technology companies, your smaller, let's say your tech startups, your fintechs, talk about things like Sweep South as well, that have used data from the beginning. I mean, it's not a new concept, and we've talked about this a few times, but I think it's really about, for the bigger organizations out there, and I'll have Matt from APSA on it at some point later, and he's really sort of pushing this thing around. Big companies also need to think like startups to get everything cohesive, because I think it must be incredibly difficult, a massive bank trying to get everything together. But I think that's the instances are sort of in your tech companies, fast growth, fairly new tech companies that have put all of this at the heart of what they do. They're data driven sort of by default, I guess. Let's move a little bit on to the power of micro communities. Now, there's obviously been a lot in the news about this, you know, both good and bad. One example I sort of heard yesterday on the radio was that they're busy doing elections in Uganda, and for I think 2 or 3 weeks prior to the polling, they actually pretty much switched off access to the internet, as well as, you know, social media sites, just so that nothing could be driven. And Facebook actually shut down 200 accounts that were sort of, you know, pointing the election into a different sort of direction, I guess, a little bit of propaganda there. So let's talk about, Les, you wanted to talk about this, so let's kick off with you. But, you know, the good and the bad, what's the power of micro communities?
Yeah, micro communities have always been there. Micro communities are basically your segmented audiences. You have your larger audience, and micro communities are the segmentations that have similar values, similar interests, similar goals, and you see it in your group of friends, you see it in your group of professionals. But since the lockdown and since, you know, everyone having to quarantine, these micro communities have really risen up on social media. So the likes of Reddit, the likes of Twitter, Facebook, other social media forums. A really great example of that I saw recently in the Wall Street Journal. They publish about GameStop. I think everyone has heard about the GameStop and what happened with the stock pricing. And what's really interesting is that some more senior investors mentioned that they never saw this coming. But if they were listening to the Reddit conversations, they would have known this. This was happening in the background for many, many months. And these were thousands of mentions on Reddit about, you know, these newbie investors banding together and wanting to invest on GameStop. And really, I mean, the hedge fund managers, I think many of them dropped to the floor after they saw the power of micro communities, that again, they were always there, but because they were micro, they weren't really being paid attention to. And I think it's the same with, you know, how you said about, you know, Facebook pages being closed and, you know, internet being shut down. I think for the first time we're seeing really the power of small groups banding together for one single purpose. Even if we look at the Capitol in the United States being, you know, what happened there with, you know, Trump and the protesters, this happened on social media. You know, it started with an idea that really just spread online and got a lot of people to support it and you know, action it. So if there's anything that I would predict, but also really focus on as a company and organization, is paying attention to your micro communities, not only from a business opportunity perspective, you know, targeting them and, you know, just going all in with ads, but also really listening to trends, even from a social political perspective. It will really shed light in terms of, as a brand, what do you stand for? As a brand, how should you action in terms of, you know, vendors that you work with, political issues that you stand for, values that you implement in your organization. It's definitely something that I would ask for companies to really focus on in 2021, but also governments, organizations, anyone really. But I'm definitely against silencing micro influencers or micro communities just for the sake of trying to control rebellion or trying to control something. I think instead we should have access to data and we should have access to information, and we should be able to still have that that ability to express our thoughts and join others that we have interest. But again, hate speech is still a thing, right? We still need to know that. So I think it's up to people like, or companies like Facebook to watch for hate speech as well in those micro communities. So there's two separate ends. There's the good and there's the bad, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Veronica, your thoughts before I give some of mine?
Yeah, I mean, micro communities, I think that, you know, that's been happening, you know, since the time that the Romans did their first census. There was always a need to understand, you know, what the different segmentation looks like and who the market is and, you know, how do you influence them. You know, there's a broad window on propaganda and what we've seen over the last few years. It's very tricky because with the internet, you know, we've become more susceptible, and we are easily influenced, and our opinions are a little swayed. I don't necessarily agree with shutting the information down. I think, you know, we should all, you know, cognitively have a choice to participate. The outcome is very much out of our control, and I think that is just one of the I suppose fears that the internet brings to the table. But there are so many other upsides to it. The educational component, where people actually have the opportunity to be more informed, more educated. And, you know, I say that quite boldly, specifically in a market like Africa, where there has been a lot of limitation on infrastructure, and they've really been left behind the curve in terms of where first world, you know, structures were moving towards. And nowadays, almost everybody is educated and informed. And that really is because we have the power of the internet at our fingertips. Removing that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to still sway how a decision is made subjectively or objectively. I don't think that necessarily is going to have an impact. You can't take away that something that's been given to us, you know, for more than a decade. It's not going to make such a major difference.
Yeah, and you both sort of talk about, you know, social listening. We've mentioned it before, and sort of, you know, following the trends on Reddit or whatever channel it may be. Do you think it's maybe just a lack of skills internally that people don't have, or companies don't have organizations, I mean, departments and people that can build, you know, sentiment analysis models, natural language processing, etc. Because you can't have one person just sitting there following all the social media. People know that there's a lot of value there, but they're not really able to harvest it, for lack of a better term, because they don't have any skills internally to go and actually run those sorts of models and algorithms. Yeah,
that is spot on. I think the data is there, the data is available, the API is there. Companies like Meltwater exist, where we have all access to the APIs, you know, across social media channels, and, you know, that data is available to be integrated into BI connectors and, you know, platforms built within organizations. But I think there is definitely a lack of understanding as to the power of the data that comes from social media. Maybe it's underestimated that it may not have such a big impact in the predictive models that a company may have built. Or even just a lack of skill, right, in terms of turning the data points into actionable insights. But it's definitely not something we'll give up on, right? It's really powerful. So we'll continue being the champions for that, and wanting to educate as much as possible, and wanting to have data scientists to really look at social media and online news data as a source.
Veronica, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I want to take it back to interpretation and personalization. There's a really great example of an organization that I think really hit the nail on the head, and that's Nike. Nike has been monitoring the social and media impact of Black Lives Matter, and, you know, they launched one of the biggest campaigns globally that supported that fundamentally. And if you talk about a brand that really wants to start, you know, making an emotional connection and speaking back to people without, you know, trying to sell a single shoe, they did that really well. But in order for them to do that, they need to understand these political atmospheres and the movements that's happening across the world, you know, emotionally. And again, it comes back to how you want to use the narrative of data. From a social media perspective, there's so many, you know, ways that you can do it. It's beyond just campaign monitoring. It's really understanding trends. It's business intelligence. It's all the information that is readily available for you and doesn't take a lot of research or massive forums to be established. It really is people just speaking their mind, because everybody has freedom of speech. And the interpretation of that, I mean, it's again overlaying data. You can pull that back into your financial analysis and do an overlay on your actual financial performance. Understand why it is that you had a slow performance. Is it potentially due to any of the impact you saw socially being driven online, or anything that was moving in the media in your environment? Just a great way of putting a little bit of an image behind numbers. So yeah, there's a little bit of an education strategy needed for it, potentially just new creative ways to think about how to apply the data. But I think slowly but surely people will move in that direction. It's not going to go away. People are using at least 8 different social channels personally to express themselves, and more of that should be used for organizations to understand who the consumer is.
Yeah. Big task. People with, lots of people have 8 social media accounts. It's quite a big thing to try and follow some around. Before I let you go, because we're kind of running out of time, I'd like to just quickly from both of you, what are your sort of top 2 or 3 trends in data analytics for 2021? Obviously, we've covered some of your digital predictions, but what are 1 or 2 things that you see from a data analytics point of view?
Yeah, for me, I think moving away, so definitely becoming more predictive. It's more than just being able to search a query or have structure to your data. It's about how to build out models that can start analyzing different trends and making predictions of where the future is moving towards. And again, I mean, if we had this in place, we would have probably been able to control the pandemic a little better. I really feel that that's something that's quite, that I have a strong opinion about. Secondly, I believe that it should be a unified strategy. We should be using different sources of data, and we should collectively be combining them to really get that source of truth. And we should try and see how we can bring that together to create a contextual understanding of the availability of data. And I think, we shouldn't be afraid to move away from dashboards. They're very static. I think something with real-time insights that tell us the story now and do a quick comparison of what we'd seen, delta figures of what we've seen in the previous period is really where we should be moving towards. So those are definitely the 3 things I foresee companies should be focusing on for data.
Mm-hmm. Good stuff. Okay. I mean, sorry.
I think for me, internal and external data, combining both, I think 2021 is the year for that, making the most out of the data that's out there. And I think that the second prediction, which is a large one, is again, microcommunities. Listen to your microcommunities, try to implement some of that data internally into your organization in any way, shape or form. I think creativity is key for your data analytics and data scientists out there.
Yeah, perfect. All right, well, both of you, thanks so much for joining me. Maybe just something quickly on any new or favorite coffee shops that you found in the Cape recently. So anybody who's in the Cape listening to this or heading down to the Cape, what suggestions would you give to them?
My suggestion is, since lockdown, I've invested on a Mocha Master. It's a filter coffee machine. I absolutely love filter coffees. So if you also love it, I would definitely recommend that you invest in one, and you can try as many beans and ground coffee as you'd like. So yeah, invest in a good machine.
All right. Nice.
Yeah.
Becoming a bit of a pro there.
Just so that's definitely leveling up. I still enjoy supporting like local coffee shops like Bootleggers, established in Cape Town. I really feel like with everything that's gone on, I have quite a passion to support anything local. So that's definitely a key for me, to go out of my way to go and grab a good cup of coffee from guys that have really invested their energy to understanding what makes a good cup of coffee. So I do have a filter coffee machine at home. I buy, a good Kenya blend, but it's nothing too fancy, and I definitely don't think I'm a connoisseur in this. So yeah, for me, it's about supporting local, and anything that has a little bit of an art feeling, great coffee vibe, like I'm there.
Oh, brilliant. Cool. I think my recommendation is Delbrook Cafe in St. James, Cork Bay area. Great little restaurant, really good coffee, and can kind of just walk across the road to the beach to have that. So, ladies, Veronica, thank you so much for joining me. Always great to talk to you, and hopefully we can catch up again later in the year.